Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're watching. Welcome to the Font Show. I am your host, James Fauntleroy. As always, this is the reading for Dirty Truths by Michael Parenti. I will be reading chapter 2, part 3. This one is actually going to be a real good one. Before I get into that, thank you to everyone who's watching. And for all the patrons on Patreon as well as Coffee, thank you so very much for your contributions to this channel. Without you guys, I would not be able to do this, and it literally keeps the lights on. So thank you so very much for that. Like I said, Dirty Truths, Michael Parenti, we're doing it again. This one's a good one. This is actually going to be talking about labor and unions. So this chapter is called Giving Labor the Business. So this is actually going to be a good one. It's not that long of a part, so this isn't going to be that long of a video, but I really do think that this is actually good because it gives insights as to how big business treats labor, especially in relation to corporate media. So this is actually going to be a good one, and I think that if you guys please share and give your thoughts in the comments and like this video, and please make sure to do that. That also helps with the algorithm for my channel because I know that I am being throttled and suppressed. That's just the way it is, especially with those of us who are in independent media and who are on the left or who advocate for workers, who advocate for the proletariat. Those of us who speak of these things, really it does not feed corporate interests, so they don't really like us, to have that much of a reach. So if you guys can like and share the stream if you possibly can. So, well, I got my tea right here. So I get a good sip of this. This is some good stuff. Mm. Oh, by the way, the newest reading for Blood in My Eye by George Jackson is up as well on Rockfin. So make sure to go on Rockfin if you want to hear that. But shall we get in? Shall we? Yes, we shall. Giving labor the business. Why do so many people have a negative view of workers and labor unions? In part, it's because of what is fed to them by the corporate owned news media. A 1990 City University of New York study found that programs devoted to elite personages consume, quote, nearly 10 times more PBS primetime programming hours than programs devoted to workers, end quote. Less than half of 1% of the programming dealt with workers, and it was mostly with British rather than American ones. A Los Angeles Times survey found that newspaper editors favored business over labor by 54 to 7%. My reading of this nation's newspapers leads me to wonder who the 7% might be. The media's pro business bias is pronounced enough for anyone to see. The major newspapers and weeklies have no labor section to go along with the business section. They have whole staffs reporting on business news, but not more than one labor reporter, if that. And usually, labor reporters, judging from the ones I have met, show no special grasp of labor struggles or sensitivity towards workers' issues. If they did, they would not last at that assignment and would be judged as getting too close to their subject. The media's devotion to corporate America is manifest in many TV and radio commentary shows that are glutted with conservatives. Public affairs programming is crowded with offerings like Wall Street Week, American Enterprise, Adam Smith's Money World, Nightly Business Report, and Marketplace. The network evening news is the network evening news regularly reports the Dow Jones average but offers no weekly tabulations on layoffs, industrial accidents, and long term occupational illness. When the stock market has a good day, for some reason, this is treated as good news for all of us. The press seldom refers to the political economic power of corporations. The economy itself is presented as something government and business attend to, while organized labor tags along at best as a very junior and often troublesome partner. Selfish strikers. Labor news is seldom reported except when there is a major strike. Even then, coverage is minimal and usually favors management. The press regularly presents labor as unwilling to negotiate in good faith when, in fact, management, in pursuit of high profit policies, is usually the side that refuses the contract and forces a strike. Frequently, the workers do not walk out because they don't like management's offers, but because management refuses to negotiate an acceptable contract and seeks to destroy the union and the collective bargaining process, a fact seldom noticed by the press. Instead, the union is depicted as making demands and manage it as making offers. The news media's anti labor bias is never more pronounced than during contract disputes. To offer one example among many, in 1989, members of the United Mine Workers took over a coal processing plant owned by Pittston in Southwest Virginia. I'm sorry, Pittston in Southwest Virginia. It was the first major plant takeover since the historic Flint, Michigan sit down strike by auto workers in 1937. Quote, the event had every element of a good journalistic story: conflict, drama, colorful characters, and, for television, tremendous footage, end quote, commented John Tassini. Quote, yet, as far as the national media were concerned, the historic action did not occur, end quote. While the long and bitter strike against Pittston was received was receiving scant exposure, the networks and newspapers were lavishing sympathetic coverage on coal miners' strike in the Soviet Union. During the 9-day period, the Soviet miners received a total of over 37 minutes of primetime news coverage on the major networks. Contrasts were made between the living standards of Soviet bosses and the coal miners, something the media never thought of doing in regards to Pittston owners and miners. The Soviet strikers also were portrayed glowingly as fighters for self betterment and social justice, the kind of representation never accorded to U.S. workers. Finally, in July of 1989, CBS weekly television show 48 Hours did devote an entire hour to the Pittston strike. Reporters interviewed company executives who said they wanted to resume production, but they couldn't get the union to cooperate. Scabs, Scabs basically are people who are hired in place of the union workers in order to work. So they basically are crossing the picket line in order to work for the company. Scabs said that they wanted to work, but didn't need a union to tell them what to do. They spoke at length of threats to and mistreatment from strikers. State troopers were portrayed as neutral peacekeepers, just doing their job, clearing the roads as they arrested strikers who tried to keep replacement workers, scabs, and strikebreakers from entering the mines. In a show of balance reported, CBS also interviewed strikers who said they were struggling for a contract and had to stick together until the victory was theirs. Strikers were shown at home, at rallies, and on the picket lines. Never were they shown telling the viewers what the strike was about, what actually was at stake. Missing from the entire program was referencing to the issues, the content of the conflict. Why were the miners striking? Not once did CBS mention that Pitson wanted to make deep cuts in wages and benefits, nor did CBS mention that Pitson was facing serious charges of unfair labor practices. A few such pertinent facts would have put the whole conflict in a different light. As presented by the network, the strike seemed to be a mindless contest of wills, pitting the stubborn, shrill, and rather foolish miners against the patient, soft spoken managers who only wanted to resume production, neutral police who only wanted to keep the peace, and replacement workers, scabs, who only wanted the freedom to work without union interference. Likewise, national coverage of the 1990 Greyhound bus strike offered little opportunity for the public to ascertain what was on the minds of striking workers. Company officials were afforded ample opportunity to comment, but union leaders and rank and file drivers received almost no exposure. Management's offer consisted of moderate wage increase and drastic cuts in benefits, which, taken together, amounted to real wage deduction. Yet the press treated management's proposal, riddled as it was with selective arithmetic, as a generous one. The union's proposals were accorded no media attention. Management was depicted as using replacement workers to rebuild its fleet and maintain services for the public, when in fact it was trying to break the strike and destroy the union. Throughout the strike, the images were of besieged, responsible management using versus violent, angry strikers, and latter showing the selfish indifference to the disputes to the disruptive effects their strikers was having on the economy and the public. The media's anti-labor biases should come as no surprise. Media owners themselves are among the most exploitative anti union employers and strikebreakers. Over the years, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Herald Examiner, the New York Daily News, CBS, NBC, and numerous other news organizations have been locked in bitter strikes that ended with unions being seriously weakened or totally crushed. As Washington Post owner, well, then owner, Catherine Graham is reportedly fond of saying, quote, unions interfere with freedom of the press, end quote. Now, Catherine Graham is no longer owner, is now owned by Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, one of the richest men in the world. Back to the book. When not on strike, unions and workers practice, I'm sorry, when not on strike, unions and workers practically vanish from the national media. Issues that concern them, occupational safety, declining real wages, seniority, job security, underemployment, health benefits, workplace racism and sexism, consumer safety, affordable housing, tax reform, and human services are routinely ignored or given paltry exposure. Taboo. Ugh, I can't work. I can't talk today. Taboo topics. The media treat labor management disputes and isolated incidents having no linkage to larger economic forces. Strikes are treated as aberrant disruptions of normal life, not as systemic conflicts endemic to industrial capitalism. The mutual support that strikers provide each other and the aid that unions sometimes extend to other unions is usually ignored by the news media. During past coal strikes, there was almost nothing on how farmers were bringing food to the miners. By ignoring instances of worker solidarity and mutual assistance within and between occupations, the press denies the class dimensions of the strikers and other strikes and underplays the support strikers have among other sectors of the public. While the media will talk about management, they have little to say about capital, little about the enormous wealth accumulated by owners. The billions paid out in stock dividends and interest on bonds represent a hugely inequitable upward distribution of the productive earnings of labor, a transfer of wealth from those who work to those who live mostly off those who work. Such exploitative arrangements go unnoticed or are implicitly accepted as the natural order of things, Nor is the media much bothered by the damage done to labor and job opportunities in general as big companies export jobs to cheap third world labor markets where the margin of profit is several times higher than at home. Also left untouched is the anti union biases written into the laws. Under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, employees won the right to organize and bargain collectively. Union membership grew dramatically. But the passage of the Taft Hartley Law of 1947 and various right to work laws passed by the states imposed drastic restrictions on strikes, boycotts, and labor organizing, resulting in a decline of union membership from 35% of the workforce in 1950 to 15% today. Just to let you guys know, it is now 11. I think it's last I checked, it was around 11%. So we now have 11% of workers in unions today, which means 89% of workers are not in unions in this country. 89%. Back to the paragraph. Union busting has become a major industry with more than 1,000 consulting firms teaching companies how to prevent workers from organizing and how to get rid of existing unions. Lacking adequate support from the pro business Clinton administration, a bill that would have protected striking workers from being permanently replaced by scabs failed to win congressional approval. Most of these anti labor developments go unheard in the pro business media. The National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, a federal agency intended to protect labor's right to organize and deal with grievances against management, was stacked during the Reagan Bush years with pro business appointees who refused to act on complaints and move against the many unfair anti labor practices who delayed decisions for years. The NLRB has failed to protect employees from being illegally fired for union activities and has imposed only token fines on management for serious violations. The media has had almost nothing to say about these things. Instead, the press treats the government as a neutral arbiter acting on behalf of the national interest and the struggle between management and labor. It is assumed that the public's interest is best served by avoiding strikes or getting strikers back into production as soon as possible, regardless of the terms of settlement. The police, along with courts, the president, the rest of the state apparatus, are presented as guardians of the peace, defenders of the public interest, rather than as protectors of corporate property and as bodyguards for strikebreakers. This tag in the back of my shirt. Sorry. Invisible workers. Like the news media, the entertainment media of Hollywood films and TV dramas also underrepresent or misrepresent working people. With few exceptions, such as the movie Norma Ray, blue collar workers of both genders and whatever ethnic background play minor walk on roles as waiters, service people, gas station attendants, and the like in an affluent upper middle class media created world. When they do make a more substantial appearance, they are portrayed as emotional, visceral, simple hearted, and simple minded, incapable of leadership or collective action. Given the hostility that network and studio bosses have manifested towards organized labor in the entertainment industry, it is no wonder that labor unions are almost always portrayed in an unsympathetic light as doing the workers more harm than good. Generally speaking, whether it's a movie about factory workers, cops, and crime, or the invasion of galactic monsters, it is individual heroics rather than collective action that save the day. Solutions and victories are never won by good ordinary people struggling for mutual benefit, but by the hero in combat, defying the odds and sometimes even the authorities to vanquish the menace and let the justice triumph. No wonder the American people, including many otherwise liberal individuals, have a somewhat negative image of organized labor. No wonder some persons who are critical of racist, sexist, and anti gay attitudes still harbor anti working class and anti union sentiments of the kind propagated by the business oriented media. The situation is so bad that even the US Congress felt obliged to take note. House Report 1023-363, accompanying the Public Telecommunications Act of 1991, calls on the public broadcasting company to stop ignoring, quote, class differences and the plight of American working people, end quote, and to make greater efforts to meet its, quote, obligation to encourage diversity in programming, including programming which addresses the lives and concerns of American workers and their families in documentaries, dramas, and public affairs programs, end quote. The report also noted that, quote, public television station boards typically are dominated by business interests, even though working Americans are key supporters of public television, end quote. Unfortunately, the report had little to say about media's treatment of labor unions, an omission that itself may be a reflection of the anti union bias that permeates the business dominated political culture. With its monopoly over mass communication, business has been able to present a largely unchallenged picture of big labor as an eviscerous and nearly self interested force that does itself, the economy, and the public no good, driving up prices with this incessant demands, serving itself while creating costs that must be passed on to the rest of us. Labor has no direct means of countering this negative image among the general public. If there exists for labor a free market of ideas, it is not to be found in the corporate owned mass media. That was Giving Labor the Business, Chapter 2, Part 3, in Dirty Truths by Michael Parenti. Yeah. So, yeah, this was very interesting because basically, you know, um, there's a lot of us that are basically taught how invasive unions are. We're always taught that, they make these, you know, unreasonable demands, of these corporations, and these corporations just trying to act fair in the free market, and they're the ones that are driving up the price because if you raise the prices for the labor, then the company has to raise the prices and then causes inflation, even though real wages haven't barely went up at all. And guess what? We still have these corporations constantly increasing their prices. But that's capitalism, though, because capitalism is a system that requires infinite growth on the planet that has finite resources. Companies will go over their uh, projections, and they go over the year over year profits of how they grew, you know, within their companies. This reminds me back when I was used to work for Sears. And during our meetings at Sears, we would have a team meeting every single morning, and then we would go over last year's profits for the store and then the projections for this year. And it was always that we had to do more, even if we went up like a third of a percent. Like, let's say it was, we made, let's say we made $110,000 last year. Well, if we made 130,000, $140,000 this year, well, then that's what they wanted. Even though we have the same amount of people working last year as we do this year, even though we have the same amount of products, guess what? Still had to raise the price. And the thing is that not just these companies but what about the products that they hold? Well, the people whose products that they hold, like for instance, maybe Levi Strauss, it could be um oh my god, what's the name of that company? It could be Kenmore, it could be Sealy, whatever these companies are. They also do the same thing. See, now they are also increasing their profits year over year. So that means it makes their product more expensive for Sears to buy in order to sell. So then they also raise their prices for them. Well, then that also goes back to the people who create the raw materials, who get the raw materials, right? The people who get the different metals, who maybe get the fabric, who may have to get the foam, or who may have to get the rubber, things like that. Well, they also increase their prices year over year in order, for the raw materials that they sell to these companies in order to produce this product. And then these companies ship their products to the retailers who also have to increase the prices further and they have to make more money year over year before they sell it to you. That being said, the people who make the raw materials, guess what? They also have to do labor. But the thing is that for their products, maybe the construction products, maybe the steam shovels, maybe the maybe the chainsaws, for the lumber, and maybe for the mills and the machinists and things like that. Well, they also have to make more money year over year. See where I'm going? And they have to make more last year than they did the year before. Because guess what? Then it's also because their prices went up. Maybe their living, their prices for their living has went up. And so they also have to raise their prices. Plus, they're also buying some of their supplies, maybe their work boots, maybe their clothes, from these other retailers that also increase their prices year over year. And so it's a perpetual cycle where everybody ends up having to continuously increase their prices year over year. And that's basically, what you notice. And so then, because they also have to do that, then guess what? Well, then it also goes into housing and transportation, and they always have to increase these prices. And so, and a lot of times, what they'll do is they'll stagnate the workers' wages just so that they can make more money. And so, even though they're getting more expensive, and the people at the tops, their compensation is getting higher, they hold back the workers' wages, they hold back what the workers' compensation is so that they can continuously make more money. And then they also expect the workers to do more work with less help. They're understaffed. And then they also do it with little pay, less less benefits. So, because of that, then workers make even less. Then, on top of that, you also have the people who are the owners of the real estate companies and maybe the apartment communities and the housing. And so they continuously raise the price of housing no matter what, because you can't necessarily dispute the prices of housing collectively, because you know, you need a place to live, and some people will just pay through the nose for it because they have no other choice. And so, really, we're basically working, under duress. And a lot of times people don't realize that. Um, in fact, let me do this. I know I didn't plan on this, but I'm going to share my screen really quick just so that we know what that word means. So, duress under the dictionary says threats, violence, constraints, or other action brought to bear on someone to do something against their will or better judgment. Also, is similar to coercion, compulsion, force, pressure, or intimidation. Basically, meaning When it comes to workers working under duress, what that means is we have no choice but to take that job that pays that low wage, because every other job you get pays that same low wage. Even if you get an education, you have no choice but to accept that job at that low wage. Or even if you got an education, a higher education, and now you're working at a job where it's trained for that. Guess what? You're still They lower the wages and it goes lower year over year, or the value of your wages goes down. So that's what happens when you're working under duress. And we can live under duress because we have no choice but to play through the nose these higher rent costs. We have no choice but to pay for these higher transportation costs. We have no choice but to pay these higher taxes too. And so because of that, we're constantly under the gun, because it's either pay this much that you really can't afford, or be homeless, starve, don't have an education. Because how many of you guys are have student loans that you have to pay, and because of Joe Biden making student loans, making it so that student loans cannot be, um, you cannot declare bankruptcy on student loans through his bankruptcy bill that he did. You're now under duress to pay your student loans. So we have a nation of people that are constantly under duress. When it comes to working, when it comes to their housing, their education, our food, when it comes to these things, we're constantly under duress. And people don't realize it, is that we're constantly under the threat of homelessness. We're constantly under the threat of hunger. We're constantly under the threat of basically nakedness. We're constantly under the threat of I mean, if we're homeless, then guess what? Then we're under the threat of being called, the police calling us, because homeless is considered illegal basically. So then you also have your safety constantly under concern. Those of us who are parents, if we become homeless, then guess what? They take our kids away. And then here's the crazy part. They'll take your kids away if you're homeless, or if you can't provide for your kids financially, and then they'll give them over to a foster parent. And then that foster parent will actually get thousands of dollars for the state just to take care of that kid, instead of giving it to the parent who actually was, financially had hard times. The system is sick. And so to fight back against that duress, this is what unions exist for. And then these unions who fight against the duress, fight against us being under duress constantly, are demonized by corporate media, are demonized even by our fellow citizens, because they've been propagandized, brainwashed, basically, against their own interests. And so then when we try to organize, really, you have some people that go, well, they're just making it more difficult for us. When really, it's really for your own good that these workers may be striking, because they're making it harder for these corporations to put you under duress. The less duress, the better. And that's the thing that we need to realize. This is why I personally am a fan of worker co ops and workers owning the places that they work, because it is absolutely necessary. Because if you own the place that you work, are you working under duress? No. This is why tenants unions are important, or just having a housing first model, because if you're not under duress for housing, then guess what? Usa. Those cortisol levels go down, don't they? That stress level goes down, doesn't it? Right? You're no longer under duress because guess what? You don't have to worry about losing your housing. You're no longer under duress because you don't have to worry about your utilities getting shut off because they, because you can't afford it. You don't have to work under duress because guess what? If you own, basically, if you're part owner of the workplace, if you're a worker owner, and guess what? Then you're not under basically the thumb, so to speak, or the boot of your totalitarian boss to work for less and for them to take your surplus labor away. And then you're just left with very little, you're left with crumbs. And then you expect to give those crumbs over to people who take almost all your crumbs away or all your crumbs away, and you're left with nothing. And then you're even still having to shell out crumbs to people who you don't really have any crumbs left. And then you have middlemen like payday loans who also are the ones in some of these banks that are the middlemen that say, "Are you under duress? I can help you out." And then they make it and they exacerbate the problem even further. So, am I a fan of unions? I think unions are in the right direction, but I want y'all to own the establishment you work for. You look, you're a driver for UPS. I want you to be part own. I want you to be a worker owner. I want you to own a piece of UPS. You work for Amazon. I want you to own a piece of Amazon and have a democratic say over how Amazon is ran. You deserve that. You're a worker. Your labor, your blood, sweat, and tears basically go into that company. Therefore, yeah, you own part of it. You know, you should. And so, because of that, hell, I don't care if you work in a Nike store. Yes, you should own part of Nike and have a democratic say over how Nike is ran. You should also have a democratic say of how that particular store is ran. You should be voting for your managers. You guys should have elections for GM, assistant GM, other assistant managers, shift supervisors. You should have a democratic say over who supervises over you, who coordinates what goes on at your workplace. You should have a democratic say over who does all that. People think this is wild. People think this is crazy. But if you ask people if democracy is a good thing, they say, well, yeah. So why don't you have it in the workplace? Why don't you have it there? And please do not come here and tell me, well, we have investors and they invested their money. And it's like, you invested your time and energy. You're the ones that are actually creating the product and service. You're the ones that are actually creating the wealth. Therefore, guess what? You should be partially owning it. You should be, collectively owning it instead of just one person where they extract all the money and pocket it themselves, or a small group of people that are just pocketing it themselves. Unfortunately, we live in capitalism. That's how it works. So yeah, great part in this chapter by Michael Parenti. Thank you so very much. So once again, also the reading of George Jackson's Blood in My Eye is up on Rockfin. Uh, that was also really good. I hope you guys get into that. And stay tuned for Tuesday. I will be live at 2 p.m. on this Tuesday on this channel. On RBN tomorrow is going to be Eddie Liger from Midwestern Marx. Midwestern Marxist is going to be on the JB show tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that's going to be a really good session. And yeah, good talk, people. Good talk. So I just like to say thank you so much for watching. Hearts galore. Water your plants, water yourselves, leave the world better than you found it. Reading is fundamental, just like reading Rainbow. I got my LeVar Burton on. Yeah. Pick up a book and read. Oh, yeah. Pick up a book and read, read, read. Read, 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 read. Read, 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 read. Read, read, read some theory.